Hello, Royal History Geeks. It's Gareth here, and we are back to talk today about one of Henry VIII's Tudor queens, specifically his fourth and rather short-lived queen, Anne of Cleves, or Anna of Cleves, as she would have identified herself. And today we are asking the big question that has been levied against her since people started writing history about her, which is, was she a ugly person? Was she so physically repellent that Henry VIII, who by this point in his reign was no oil painting himself, found that he actually had to sacrifice years of negotiation so that he could be free from the marriage and be free to pursue what he would have considered a more appropriate looking bride for himself and a queen for his kingdom. The reason that we have been left with this view that Anne of Cleves was an ugly Flanders mare, although we should note Henry never actually used that phrase, that's something that came later, is because Henry decided he wanted to marry after Jane Seymour had died. Jane Seymour had been his third wife. She died in complications related to childbirth, and that meant there was a vacancy for Queen. Henry, this was quite novel for Henry because when he married, he normally had found the new wife he wanted to marry before he'd quite finished wrapping things up with the previous one. When he first came to the throne, he knew he wanted to marry Catherine of Aragon straight away. She was a known quantity. He was married to Catherine until many years after the point that he fell in love with Anne Boleyn. So when he finally was able to free himself from Catherine, he knew exactly where he was headed. And similarly, by the time Jane had come on the scene, or at least come into Henry's affections, he was tiring of Anne, wanted to find a way to get rid of her, but he had no doubt as to what the destination of travel was. He wanted to be free of Anne, so he would end up with Jane, who he'd fallen in love with. However, Jane dies with Henry very much still in love with her. Interestingly, David Starkey says in his book he died was still in love with Jane, or at least not much out of it, which is potentially quite a acute observation. Who knows how his feelings would have evolved over time. But nonetheless, he had not been thinking about another woman. He had not been thinking about another queen for his kingdom. So that meant he was actually free to pursue the normal way that a king of a power like England would be able to explore making a marriage. And that was effectively through diplomatic channels. So he sends his ambassadors off to come and identify all the eligible brides in Christendom and effectively to draw up a shortlist for him. And he is interested both in what diplomatic alliance they will bring with them, but Henry being Henry, he is also very much interested in what they are going to be like as a person, their personage, and what they're going to be like in terms of their beauty and their gifts and the finer qualities that make what Henry would have made a woman worthy of both his attentions, his affections, and the crown, the consort crown, the Queen's crown of England. So, to cut a long story short, after many different pieces of analysis as to who the best bride should be, he is recommended that he should give his hand in marriage to the Lady Anna of Cleves. Cleves was a state within the Holy Roman Empire, which, while not Protestant, had its then duke had sympathetic views to reformed theology, to reforming the Catholic Church, and had problems with the powers of the Pope, which sounds very Protestant, doesn't it? But we won't go into reasons now as to why it wasn't. But they were not Protestant, but were perhaps on the fringes of a Protestant power bloc. And for various reasons, this, of course, had some synergies with Henry's own situation. He was a Catholic, there's no doubt about that, theologically, even if he was open to some aspects of reform. And he, of course, himself had big problems with the power of the Pope. So, for all kinds of reasons, this represented a great diplomatic opportunity. But he said, okay, I'm open-minded to this. But before it goes any further, I need to see what she looks like. So Hans Holbein, who is the great renowned painter of the Tudor court, who's painted a lot of the great figures, and actually, frankly, it's really through his lens that our visual understanding of Henry VIII's court comes down to us. That's not to say there aren't others, but when you think of a classic picture of Henry VIII, or many other people in the Tudor court, you will be thinking about a Hans Holbein portrait. So he is dispatched to go and paint a portrait of Anna of Cleves, or Anna of Cleves. And he comes back with something so beautiful that Henry falls head over heels in love. And he actually spends a long period of time almost fantasizing, daydreaming, obsessing. We know Henry could obsess about this woman that he's seen, the princess in the portrait. So as you can imagine, as negotiations conclude and it's determined he's going to marry her, he's very, very, very keen to see her. She has quite an arduous journey to England. It's quite a trek in those days, and for various reasons experiences several delays. But she arrives safe and sound, and she goes to stay in Rochester. And she is anticipated, it is anticipated that she will rendezvous with Henry in a couple of days. She's got a little bit of downtime to get herself together, then she'll meet Henry, they'll be properly introduced, and the rest will be history. They will marry, and they will live happily ever after, or some variation of that sentiment. However, so keen is Henry to meet Anna that he decides to surprise her on the 1st of January, New Year's Day. But not only does he want to surprise her in the sense that he wants to turn up before their prearranged appointment, he actually decides to go in disguise with some of his mates, some of his men, and they go dressed in cloaks and hoods to look like messengers, lowlier men. They arrive, they enter the Queen's chamber saying they have a message from the King. Anna's a bit startled by this, but she accepts the token that they've brought from the King, and is then horrified that one of these men, who would have been by this point rather old, gets up, embraces her, and kisses her. Now, what Anna doesn't realise is that this is her husband, the King of England, and their meeting gets off completely on the wrong foot. It's sorted out in the here and there. He introduces himself. There's an explanation. They both make the best of a bad situation. They, according to chroniclers, they exchange some pleasantries, and on the face of it, all is well. However, after this, Henry is furious. He does not believe this woman is the woman that was presented to him by others. He believes he's been deceived, and he does not want to go through with the marriage. He does have to go through with the marriage. He's persuaded that he's far too into it to be able to get out of it now. So he goes through with the marriage, but he never makes his peace with it. He is unable to consummate his marriage to Anna. He says he just can't bring himself to do it. The problem is not with him. He's very clear about that. He thinks he'd be able to do it in a different situation. He goes into quite some detail about what has happened to his body physiologically in the night as a result of certain dreams. So there's no issue with Henry's ability to perform, but he just can't do it with Anna. Clearly, that cannot go on. He's still at a stage where he believes, and I think everyone else would have believed, that one son is not, he had one legitimate son at this point, is not enough to hang the succession of England on in a world of sadly, of high infant mortality. He needs more children, he needs more sons, so this clearly isn't going to work out. And he manages to obtain, on fairly spurious grounds, an annulment from Lady Anna of Cleves. So the question is, can she really have been all that bad looking? And I actually think there are a number of reasons to suggest that no, she almost certainly was not so physically repulsive, or even notably more unattractive than most other people, that Henry would be unable to do the deed and go through with it. And there's a few observations I'd like to make as to why I think my point of view is the correct one and actually can be grounded in a degree of evidence. The first is that Hans Holbein, who's that great portraitor, painter that we were talking about earlier, he is the one that has painted this portrait of Anne of Cleves that Henry's fallen in love with. Um, and you might think if Henry feels duped or deceived, he's going to be really, really angry with Holbein. And he is going to make sure that man never works again. This man was meant to be on his side. He was meant to be trusted by Henry to deliver something for Henry. And he seems to almost become involved in some big catfishing scam. But Henry doesn't punish Hans Holbein. He doesn't make life particularly trickier for him. There may have been some initial tension, but Holbein goes on to paint some very important piece of artworks for the Tudor dynasty in Henry's own lifetime. So he obviously doesn't think that the painting is that inaccurate. Second piece of evidence, and this one's much softer, but much later on when Henry VIII marries Catherine Parr, Anna of Cleves is overheard as suggesting she feels a bit slighted and a bit insulted because she considers herself to be much prettier than Catherine Parr. It perhaps, although she doesn't say this, but perhaps there's a sense that Catherine Howard, who's the woman that Henry goes off with when he realises it's not going to work with Anna. But Catherine Howard, maybe she was a beauty. Maybe Anna's sort of saying, "Yeah, I can get that. She's a can see why I go for her." But Catherine Parr, I'm better looking than she is. And what's interesting is obviously the fact that she thinks she's reasonably attractive doesn't necessarily mean that she is. I suppose we've all known people who think that they are perhaps more attractive than they are. But when people report this story, they don't add on, she's she's kidding herself. She's really nasty looking. They don't say that. Now that doesn't mean they didn't think it. Obviously, people did have to be careful with what they said about other people. But it's possible that that sentiment that she was at least as good, maybe better looking than Catherine Parr was something that people were sympathetic to. Perhaps people could understand her point of view. But the thing that I think is fascinating, which nobody else really seems to talk about, so maybe I'm wrong, but I think it's important, is do you remember that story I said toward the beginning of this video about how Henry showed up in disguise, him and his men go into Anna's chambers, pretend to be messengers, and he ends up embracing her and kissing her, and she is freaked out. Well, what I find very interesting about that tale, we know that's broadly reliable because it comes to us from quite a few different sources as well. So they differ in the level of detail that they give us. But after going in and after seeing her, Henry still embraces her and he still kisses her. He has not decided from just one glance that she's completely different to her portrait and that she's too repulsive to touch. Perhaps I'm being a bit naive. Maybe on the one hand, he'd started this expedition, so he couldn't back out of it then. Although I think Henry probably was impulsive enough to decide not to go. As much as he was impulsive to go and kiss her, I think he would have been strong-minded enough to decide not to. Or perhaps he was just so caught up in the moment he hadn't really stopped to look properly. But I think it's perfectly possible that actually, on first glance, he thought, yeah, this is the woman I expected to see. I can see where the portrait was coming from, and I'm pretty happy to go up and embrace her. I'm pretty happy to try and kiss her. So the question is, if I'm right, and actually she wasn't physically unattractive, notably at all, then why was Henry unable to do the deed? And why was Anna unable, as a result, to remain Queen of England? And I think there's a few different theories that circulate about this. One is that, and this is almost a feminist revision, which is, as a feminist, I've got some time for, but as a historian, I'm a little bit more cautious about, which is that Anna was freaked out by Henry. At this point, he would have seemed like an old, very large man who, because of an ulcer on his leg, would have had issues with hygiene. It would not have been a pleasant experience to be in his presence, let alone in his bed. One of the arguments goes Anna was simply unable to consummate the marriage, and as a result, almost to save face, Henry turned the story around. He vociferously protested that the issue was not with him, but with her appearance, and a way was found to get them both out of that marriage. And Anna's cooperation is cited as evidence of that she was keen to get out of it too. But I'm not sure that that's a view that's entirely sympathetic to the culture of the day. Anna would have been raised knowing that one day she was going to marry a foreign prince or a foreign duke or a foreign king or a foreign ruler. She probably expected them to be German, but nonetheless, she was raised with a very strong belief that her role, sorry, would be to go to another country, marry a great person, and do all she could to advocate the cause of Cleves and for her own dynasty, her own nation, her own family. That is what her expectation would have been. And as unappealing a bedfellow as Henry would have been, I don't think she would have let that stop her from her purpose. And I say that with the greatest sympathy for Anna, because I think she would certainly have been in a horrible situation. But I don't think we can say that Anna wanted out and basically Henry gave it to her. Also, there is reasons. Just if you remember earlier, I talked about how she felt a bit snubbed by Catherine Parr and made those comments about being prettier. That suggests that she wasn't entirely. She was well looked after when when the marriage was annulled, but nonetheless, it suggests she did feel that her nose was put out of joint, and she probably would have preferred to remain queen, and perhaps she was always hopeful that she would again be taken back by Henry, not probably because of any great desire for Henry, but because she felt that was her role, and she felt that that would be something that accorded her whole mission to England. So I think it's unlikely that Anna was the prime instigator in that. Recently, I've read a fiction book about Anne of Cleves by Alison Weir, who is, of course, a great Tudor historian and writer. And because it's a fiction book, although it's based on very thorough research, Weir feels a bit more confident to explore theories which you couldn't really argue from a historical point of view as being worthy enough, probably, to take centre stage in a natural history book, but are actually can be experimented with during fiction. And that is that Anna came to that marriage bed with Henry as not being a virgin, and that Henry was able to tell that by investigating her body, which is of course exactly what Henry does claim. He does claim that he inspected her body, and he does not believe that she's any maid, which would suggest that she'd probably had a child, which is, I don't want to do spoilers, but frankly, if you haven't read the latest Alison Weir book when it's been out for a year, you need to sort your priorities out, because something's going wrong in the choices that you're making. But that's a big plot of of the Alison Weir novel on Anna of Cleves. That she had actually had a child earlier in life. Henry can tell this, and Henry's simply just unable to do the deed because he doesn't believe that she's a virgin, which would have been important to him. Although how he deals with Catherine Howard, who probably wasn't exactly untouched by man either, it perhaps needs exploring. In that conversation, but it's an interesting theory at any rate. But I think we don't particularly need to have an elaborate theory to think about why, despite the fact Anna might have broadly looked like her portrait suggested she did, Henry just couldn't make the marriage work. In the scenario, Henry's little game that I outlined at the beginning, where he pretended to be a messenger, and go to Anna in disguise, and she didn't recognise him. That wasn't just some game Henry invented, but under the guise of courtly love, people in England who were educated, people in England who knew the ways of the court, would have understood what was meant to be happening. The idea that the lover comes to his mistress in disguise and that she recognises him through the power of love. That kind of culture, that kind of uh, gains of love were very common to Henry and they were very important to Henry. And the fact Anna couldn't see what was happening shows how different they were in terms of background, how different they were in terms of culture. And I think the word we're probably looking for to see what went wrong or what didn't go right, the word's chemistry. And I think it's probably only in a world where online dating is a thing that we could probably have a little bit more understanding through what Henry was going through. Because I'm sure there are many people watching this video who will have had experiences where they've been chatting to someone online. They've seen a picture, they've maybe seen a few pictures of that person. They go and meet with them for their first real world date. And it isn't that they don't look like their picture. There's no suggestion that they've deliberately only put the best pictures to distort what they really look like online, although of course that happens too. But you're looking at them and you're like, it's not that the pictures are bad, but I still just didn't quite expect you to look like that, to sort of move like that when you talked, to sort of click like that. And I think that's probably some of what Henry is going through. He built up this fantasy of Anna based just on her picture, but then he brought so much more to the table that when she didn't do the most basic thing that he was expecting his Anna to be able to do, it all crumbled. They could never really have that first moment again. There was never any chance for that chemical reaction, which was so important to Henry, and he just couldn't do it. He could never recommit after his picture, not the picture that was in the portrait, but the picture in his mind had crumbled, and he never recovered from it. I think added to that, it's also worth mentioning that Anna was unable to do any of the things Henry might have expected her to be able to do if she was going to correct that picture. For example, Henry liked women who could sing, who were gifted in music, who were again the sorts of women that would be very used to this game of courtly love and would have understood what was happening when the messenger appeared with a token from the king. They would have understood that was Henry. But in Cleaver, although women had some freedoms that English women did not, they were not encouraged to be musical or to sing. That was seen as light behaviour, as something unworthy of a great woman. So not only did Anna not have those skills, she was probably rather nervous about even experimenting in that direction initially, because it's something that from her background was seen as a negative and not as a plus. So had Anna had a chance of wooing Henry back round after that disastrous first encounter, then unfortunately her upbringing did not really prepare her or equip her with the skills to do that. I have talked for long enough. The only other thing I'm just going to mention quickly is it's possible that some of you are listening to this thinking, okay, that's all very well, but way back in 1537, when an ambassador was first compiling for Henry his report of the eligible royal noble women of Europe, he did mention Anne of Cleves, and he said that she was not known to be of any great personage or beauty, which could, of course, when read in the context of what happened 3 years later, be seen as another justification that Anna was maybe a bit on the rough side. But I think that's probably not the right way to talk about it. Elizabeth Norton, her very good biography of Anna of Cleves, explains that this ambassador who was based in Brussels not only had never met Anna, he'd probably never been in the same room as anyone that had been in the same room as Anna. So when he said there were no tales of her being of great personage or great beauty, that probably just confirms what we already know, which is that Anna was kept quite close, quite guarded, and she wasn't put on display an awful lot. So people didn't really have a sense of who she was at all. It doesn't really mean that there's been the counter reports that she's a bit of an ugger, because we just don't have anything that suggests that. So, Anna of Cleves, I'm so sorry for the way that history has judged you. The evidence finds nothing to suggest that the Hans Holbein portrait of you, where you look lovely, is anything other than accurate. And I hope that the rest of the tellings of history will be kinder to you than they have up until now. That's it, everyone. Thank you for watching. Do leave some comments. Do check out the blog. Do check us out on Facebook, on Twitter. We've just started an Instagram account as well. Be lovely to get to know you all better and find out what you think about Anne of Cleves and whether she has been unfairly represented by history. Thank you.